And I'm now delighted to be joined by Raymond Newell, the co-author of Johnson at Number 10. Raymond, thank you very much for joining me. Boris has said he'll hand over anything that they want, which from his point of view seems to me to be perfectly reasonable. But surely in the interests of the inquiry, it should only be asking for that which is relevant.
Thank you for having me on, Jacob. No, it's quite right that Johnson's agreed to disclose at least the messages from May 2021 onwards, when he got his new phone. The old one, of course, with security issues after his number was leaked. But you're quite right that the inquiry needs to be careful with how it uses evidence here. There will be so much detail in those messages. There will be an absolute wealth of it. The inquiry is looking at 550,000 pieces of evidence, which is a huge number to cover in a relatively short time span. Of course, within them will be some good detail, but alongside that will be a lot of noise and unnecessary detail there too.
But isn't it getting too far down in the weeds that what we really need to understand is the big issues? Why were we prepared for the wrong type of pandemic? What did we do that worked? What did we do that didn't work? Inevitably, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was limited information. People will have made mistakes. People have got some things right. But that's not really the point of the inquiry, is it?
No, certainly. I think the big interesting questions are those structural ones you allude to there. Really, how can we improve machinery of government? How can we make those processes effective? So when the next pandemic comes around, we don't make the same mistakes. It's not necessarily in the details of communications on WhatsApp, whether Johnson said something to Matt Hancock on a certain day or not, whether he said he should be injected with COVID on live TV. Of course, that's pretty immaterial to how the pandemic played out. And it's unnecessary detail, really, I think, for the inquiry to get into.
And why do you think we're taking so long? Because other countries, I think France as well as Sweden, have actually done their inquiries already. I don't think this inquiry will have finished taking evidence until 2026, with the report then to be written. We'll be in a completely different environment by the time it's finished.
I think the inquiry has become very politically charged, especially with Partygate and that issue adding quite a bit of political salience to the inquiry. Of course, the exact findings into the pandemic and what the UK could have improved in its response will be difficult for the government, and particularly Sunak, to navigate, especially given his role in the pandemic during the second wave, when he was the most staunch advocate within government against lockdown. But that really is the core of the issue, that it is quite a political process, and the inquiry wants to go into detail to make sure it gets it right. Of course, in that process... But it
is, as we were saying earlier, it's the big issues. Was Rishi Sunak as Chancellor right about the scale of furlough, of the government support schemes to keep business going? Did that economically make sense? But that's not an issue that's dependent on WhatsApp messages and emails and all of that. That's a big economic decision that requires expert analysis from economists rather than gossipy emails.
Certainly, no, I quite agree. And I think it's got to be very difficult for the inquiry to not get lost in the fantastic detail, I'm sure, and there will be plenty of headlines that the messages could potentially create, as we saw earlier this year with Isabel Oakeshott's messages that played out in the Telegraph. There will be plenty of headlines, but it's trying to sort out what's the important facts of the pandemic, what lessons can we take away for the future, and what's just ephemeral Westminster gossip.
And so what do you think Lady Hallett's up to? Why does she want all these emails rather than focusing on what seems to be the obvious course for the inquiry, and indeed following one of the inquiry's remits to get on with it in a timely manner?
There will be some fantastic detail in there, no doubt, that helps the inquiry understand government decision processes. And of course, much government business, as you well know, is done over WhatsApp, is done in those messages between ministers in that forum. So I imagine for those reasons, she very much wants the messages, but also because there is a lot of interest in some of those early phases of the pandemic where there was so much chaos, where there was so much informal day-to-day contact, where decisions had to be taken in that way. and there was no other choice but to use WhatsApp for those.
But surely what matters is the decisions that were taken, not the process of taking them. That everybody was working with imperfect information at the beginning of the pandemic. And what matters is, were the decisions right, and how do we learn from that, rather than was the decision made at a formal cabinet meeting or on a WhatsApp message?
I think for the learnings of the inquiry to be replicable, we have to learn what processes worked as well as what decisions worked. Of course, the next pandemic, there's no guarantee it'll be like the last. There's no guarantee it'll affect the population in the same way, that it will be predominantly elderly people affected by the disease. So to really learn from that decision-making process, learn when does government get the decisions right? When does it get them wrong? And how does it get there? I think will be very important for the inquiry to find out.
Well, thank you very much, Raymond. It won't surprise viewers to know that I tend to send messages by semaphore rather than by WhatsApp, but therefore they won't be of interest to the inquiry.